Welcome back. I'm Anna Yudin. I'm an author and doctor of clinical psychology. Today I want to talk about 20 books that made me who I am today. I'm sure that as soon as I finish recording this, I'm going to remember 5 books that were super integral to me that I completely forgot to talk about. I'm going to be kicking myself, no doubt. And that is because a lot of the books, as you can see behind me, are no longer with me. They're in the place where I'll be living next. And so I don't actually have them all in front of me to look at them all. This was kind of an attempt at doing it by memory. Also, I'll be talking about nonfiction. Certainly there are books that heavily influenced me in terms of my literary style, but I am mostly talking about my personality and my self-development today. So without further ado, here are 20 nonfiction books that most shaped me into who I am today. Number 1, Man's Search for Meaning. This is a really big one for a lot of people. If you're not familiar with Man's Search for Meaning, it's written by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and a psychologist who then went on to develop something called logotherapy, a type of talk therapy that focuses on meaning making. Man's Search for Meaning is one of those books whose takeaways were so poignant, so digestible to me that I memorized them. And I'm a very forgetful person. I'm kind of the type of person that I learn about something and then I forget about it. But with this, it was very much not the case. I very much remember thinking that I related to his notion that there are 3 ways to make meaning in life. You can make meaning by doing something that is meaningful to you, like creating a particular type of art or doing a particular job, by experiencing something like a beautiful song, a beautiful sunrise, or by enduring suffering. And this third one, obviously, he knows the most extreme form of human suffering and endurance. And in the book, he made a really compelling case for how your attitude in life is the one thing that no one can take away from you. Even in the most dire of circumstances when everything else is taken away from you, your attitude on life, your willingness to endure the suffering and come out on the other side is something that no one can take away. And so I think this is a really important book in terms of not only history, but resilience and meaning making. And I would strongly recommend it to anyone who's struggling with either some sort of mental issue or stress or trauma, or is just going through a rough patch. Book number 2 is Self-Compassion by Kristin Neff. I think I read Self-Compassion during the year 2021, which was when the pandemic was really hardcore, and I was going through a really rough time personally in my life. I just had a friendship breakup that was pretty stressful for me, and I'd experienced a series of losses in addition to that, like actual people passing away. And I had a lot of shame about who I was at that point in life, and I was isolated and lonely. And when I read this book, it helped me understand what self-compassion is. Kristin Neff is a leading researcher in the field of self-compassion, and she talks about how self-compassion is about mindfulness, self-kindness, and understanding that this is a universal human experience. Compassion and self-compassion are choosing to treat yourself and others gently and kindly when things are going wrong, when something is imperfect, when you make a mistake. And she breaks down a lot of the self-compassion myths, like, if you're easy on yourself, then you're just going to let yourself off the hook. She talks about how the research doesn't support this. The research very much supports self-compassion being beneficial on all fronts. So if you're a person that struggles with either self-compassion or compassion for others, I would recommend this book. Book number 3 is The Charisma Myth. The charisma myth talks about what charisma is, and charisma is presence, meaning like being present with people, making them feel like they're the most important person in the room while they're talking to you. Warmth, which is like this feeling of goodwill, of like wanting to be friendly with them. And power, which is kind of synonymous in this context with confidence. Exuding power in yourself, making it known that you respect yourself too, not just the other person that you're talking to. So she talks about like different types of charisma, how charisma looks, exercises to implement charisma, and she talks about the myth of charisma, which is that either you have it or you don't, because like she teaches you through those different exercises, charisma is definitely something that you can cultivate, that you don't need to just be born with. Book number 4 is Think and Grow Rich. This was a book that was written in like the early 20th century, so it's not like super applicable to today. It's a little bit new agey and it's mostly focused on how to get rich. But the part that I found most impactful was not related to anything financial. The part that I found most impactful was the countless number of examples that the author gave to make the case that the richest people, the most successful people, the most persevering people are the ones that continued to try again and again and again after countless failure, who continued to believe in themselves even when others told them, no, you're thinking too big, this isn't possible, you're not going to be able to do it, this doesn't exist. And this is something that I've observed in other contexts too. It's pretty easy to notice the pattern that every single person that made it really big and really successful had failure after failure after failure and continued persevering and continued believing in themselves. So although this book didn't impact me much financially, it really impacted me in my attitude on perseverance and positivity and just continuing to go, even if it seems like you're failing, and just believing, having this blind faith that you are going to get what you want. Book number 5, Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. This is a book written by a Jungian psychoanalyst. Jungian psychology is one of the older forms of therapy. It's written so beautifully. It touches on different fables, retells them in just such vivid ways, and then analyzes them, interprets them psychologically using all this Jungian symbolism. Aside from being incredibly inspiring in discussing the wild woman archetype and a type of female spirituality, this book really helped me learn about how to interpret artwork from a Jungian standpoint. It was the first time I ever came into contact with anything Jungian, and it was sort of like my gateway into Jungian psychology. And it also just exposed me to all these beautiful fables from different parts of the world, most notably the Selkie fable. I really related to that, and that is part of why the novel that I'm currently trying to publish has a lot of water spirit mythology. I would recommend this one for anyone who's interested in depth psychology, who likes learning about different fables and legends, all while in the most beautiful lyrical tone. Book number 5 is Becoming Bulletproof by Evie Pompouras. Evie Pompouras is a former Secret Service agent, and she has a lot of interesting insights in this book on how to be more resilient, on how to exude confidence and power, so sort of like that charisma that I was talking about. It also has some chapters on using body language to notice deception. This I don't put too much stock in just because I don't believe that it really is accurate based on the research. But aside from that, I thought that this book was really impactful to me. This was also one of those books that I read when I was going through a hard patch, and it helped me feel stronger and more powerful as a person. And to see a female role model who in a lot of ways I think embodies Stoic philosophy was really impactful to me. Book number 6 was Ikigai. So this is a book about the concept of Ikigai, which is this Japanese term for basically a person's mission in life, what they're supposed to do in terms of their career, that sits at the conjunction between what they love doing, what they're good at, and what benefits society. And so it gave me some clarity on that, although I think I've always known that my Ikigai is writing. But what I also loved about this book was it talked about super centenarians, these little hotspots all across the globe where people live to over 100 years old regularly. And it talked about the different lifestyle habits like diet and exercise and social connectedness that are intrinsic to the people that live in these different places. So I think it was not only influential in the concept of Ikigai for me, it was also really influential in my attitude on health and longevity. Book number 8 was The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal. Kelly McGonigal is a PhD researcher, and The Upside of Stress basically makes the case that stress is not what's killing us, it's our attitude on stress that's killing us. I actually made an entire video on this book on my psychology channel, so I will pop that up here if you want to take a look at the book more in depth. Basically, I would strongly recommend this book for anybody that is living a high stress life and just can't get rid of the stressor and doesn't know how else to cope with it. Because the good news is huge research studies have shown that it is not stress itself that's necessarily going to put you in an early grave. If you have a healthy outlook on stress and you cope with it in healthy ways, then it might actually be a protective factor. Book number 9 is Self and Others. Now this one is a little bit more advanced, so I would mostly recommend it for specifically therapists or therapy students who are psychodynamically leaning. It focuses on object relations theory, which is all about the way that we interact with other people and defense mechanisms and sort of the images that we have of ourselves and other people in our head. It helped me learn a lot of really insightful things about defense mechanisms and also about cluster B personalities, particularly borderline and narcissistic. So if you're up for kind of a more deep end depth psychology book, that one was extremely informative. Book number 10 is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. He was a Roman emperor and a Stoic philosopher, and I actually just made an entire video on this book, so I will also pop that up here. If you're into Stoicism, resilience, living with honor and integrity and Stoic principles, then you're going to love this book. It's actually pretty digestible. It's written in like a very short diary form, and it was very impactful for my life and just helping me deeper ingrain the Stoic philosophy. Book number 11 was Dolce far niente. This is a book that's like a little bit more on the light side, but I think I really needed to hear it. It's about this common attitude in Italy of the sweetness of doing nothing. So I'm a person that's very go, 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 hyper productive. I sometimes struggle to be in what people call my feminine energy. Ugh. Don't love this term, but I definitely relate to what it's saying. I think this book, ironically, would be a good way to get more in your feminine energy. Oh my God, I'm cringing so hard at myself right now. But it's true. You know, if you're a person that struggles with hyperproductivity and compulsivity and just not really living in the moment and appreciating life and the little things and the beauty of life, then this book is a really great way to dive into it, all while appreciating a part of Italian culture. It's a book that I often think about, especially in the spring and summer that's when I read it, was in the spring/summer. That's just naturally more of when this attitude makes sense to bring up in life, because in the winter, it's kind of a different place in the cycle. Book number 12 is Mindset by Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck is a PhD researcher in the idea of growth versus fixed mindsets. And although I didn't love the book in the sense that I felt that there were just too many examples kind of making the same point, I did really resonate with the message of it, which is that what is most important in life is a person's ability to focus on the process, not the outcome, and to take a growth mindset, meaning to understand that they can always improve, they can always put in more effort and more time into something to get better at it, rather than just seeing things as, well, it's all about, the fixed traits that you have or the inborn or intrinsic traits that you have. There's nothing you can do to master those to a greater level. It also really made me think about parenting and how a lot of parents commonly praise sort of fixed traits and tell their kids, oh, you're so smart or you're so beautiful or all this different stuff, when what they should really be praising is a growth mindset, is focusing on the process, not the outcome. You worked so hard on that test, or you practiced so much for piano and it turned out so much better than when you first started out. She goes into all the research in the book about how having a growth mindset is associated with a lot of positive outcomes and having a fixed mindset is associated with a lot of negative outcomes. Book number 13 is Why Woo Woo Works. So this is a book that takes a very fair look at the research on different sort of new age practices, and the author himself is a scientist. What I loved about this book is it was very spiritually rich. It touched on a lot of different spiritual philosophies like idealism versus materialism versus dualism, while also just being truthful to what the research says about these different spiritual practices. Sometimes I think what can irk me about a lot of new age authors is they take like a seed of truth in the research and they just take it to such an extreme that it ceases to be truthful anymore. Like sometimes they'll use examples of research studies that have been debunked, for instance, or stories that have had their veracity questioned. I didn't feel this way about this book. I thought that it was very fair, very honest in its approach of the research, and very compelling. And it honestly gave me a lot of food for thought spiritually that has shaped me ever since reading it. Book number 14, I wasn't sure whether to mention this, but I think in some ways it has stuck with me, and that is The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. Despite some of the qualms that I have about Robert Greene, mean, I do think his work is well written and he makes a good case for his different points. I think the 48 Laws of Power have been particularly important for me in the context of career. When I was in a setting with coworkers and bosses and supervisors, I used to think about some of those lessons. For instance, I think one of the lessons was how you should never make your boss at work feel like you know more than them. And so one of the ways that I took this lesson in my career was I really emphasized asking my supervisors a lot of questions, making them feel like the experts, even when it was something that maybe I had kind of an inkling about, really making it clear that I see them as the boss and me as the inferior. And now, yeah, the book is Machiavellian in some ways, but I think you can take what resonates with you and discard the rest. There are certainly a lot of laws in there that I disagreed with, that I thought were a little bit evil, just a little bit, but it was still an interesting read. And at the very least, it got me thinking about, well, what do I think about this? How would I approach this? Do I agree or disagree with him? Because there are a lot of really important subject matters in there. Book number 15 was The Untethered Soul. So I read this book when I had COVID the first time. And I was so sick, I was alone because my partner was out of town at that time. I had a high fever and it talked a lot about mortality. And so that was kind of funny because I was like, oh my God, I'm reading about death and I feel like I'm dying right now. But this book made me realize something very important, which is that all the different identities that we ascribe to ourselves are just illusions. They're ever changing, they're flexible, they don't truly make us who we are. It kind of makes the case that who we truly are is just the observer inside us, this consciousness that experiences everything. There are no identities or traits that we can really ascribe to that consciousness because our identities change, our circumstances change. So it really got me thinking about identity more philosophically, about what it means to be myself, about consciousness, about mortality. I liked the first half of it more. The second half I thought was a little bit boring, but again, it brought up these questions for me that I think have impacted me to this day. Book number 16 is Quiet by Susan Cain. This is a book that focuses on introversion and a lot of the ways that introverts are kind of penalized for being themselves in American culture. As a very introverted, shy, quiet, socially anxious person, I shouldn't say this. I shouldn't ascribe these identities to myself, especially since they're so limiting. Scratch all that. As a person who has identified as introverted in the past. There we go, that's better. This book felt very validating in a lot of ways. And so if you feel like you're more on the introverted side, this is a book that I would really recommend. It talks a lot about the research. It talks a lot about why things shouldn't be this way, why there are a lot of benefits to being introverted. It's a book that I would strongly recommend. Book number 17 is Why Does He Do That by Lundy Bancroft. Lundy Bancroft is a therapist who worked with domestic violence abusers for many years. This book was absolutely groundbreaking in the way that I think about abuse. It really illustrates how the issue is never that person's anger or whatever personality disorder or mental disorder they have or whatever trauma they have. He makes a really strong case that the issue with abuse is always that person's decision to act abusively. And he talks about how, for instance, abusers, they can abstain from abusing when they're in front of other people, when the police walks in. They can abstain from breaking their own items, but for some reason they can't abstain from abusing when it's behind closed doors, or they can't abstain from hurting other people's belongings, because it's not a matter of impulse control. It's a matter of decision. They're making a decision to do those things. And he talks about a lot of things in that book. He talks about why an abusive mentality is created, how it looks, the different phases of abuse. And his work isn't specifically working with abusive men, so that is what he talks about, abusive men specifically. And he also just seems like such a lovely person. I've watched some YouTube interviews with him, and Lundy Bancroft seems like a truly great person. Number 18, this is another one of those that I was like, do I include this? And I ultimately decided yes. Wheel of the Year. This really gave me a lot of insight into how to live a more nature-aligned, cyclical-aligned lifestyle. It has some beautiful ways of celebrating the different seasons, very pagan-rooted. I do a lot of these things at the turning of the seasons, at the different Sabbats, at the different stages of the moon. And so a lot of the things that I read in this book, I took moving forward. So if you're into nature-based spirituality, honoring the cycles of the year, then you might really like this book. Book number 19 is the DBT Workbook. Technically, this is not nonfiction, right? Technically, this is the workbook of a therapy type. So if you need therapy, if you need the skills in this book, obviously the first line of action should be seeking a therapist, going to DBT, or going to school to learn about DBT. But I will say I learned a whole lot more from the DBT workbook than anyone ever taught me in school. If you struggle with regulating your own emotions, mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, distress tolerance, those are the 4 modules of DBT. There are a lot of worksheets for how to deal with these things in the workbook. And so if you're looking for something to add to like an emotional toolkit or to your journaling practice, I would recommend getting the DBT workbook. Again, I would recommend first and foremost going through it with a therapist. But if that's not accessible to you or for some reason you don't want to, I think the workbook could also be really important because I still use a lot of those skills myself when I need to regulate my own emotions. And number 20, again, I wasn't sure whether to include this because it wasn't like that mind-blowing for me, but it was a read that I think impacted me, and that is Friluftsliv. It's talking about the Scandinavian attitude towards living in nature, healing yourself through nature, through forest therapy, through cold swimming, through going on walks, through having green spaces and blue spaces in your surroundings, through just hearing the chirping of birds. So, it talks about some of the research and also just talks about how Scandinavian culture has this attitude of always going outside, always being in nature, no matter what the season, no matter what the weather, because it's really good for your physical and mental health. At this moment, these are the 20 nonfiction books that have most shaped me into who I am today. Like I said, I am certain that I'm forgetting some really important ones and I'm going to be kicking myself for it. Also, I wanted to let you know that as part of my newsletter at dranaudin.com, I've started releasing some of my favorite books in categories. So last weekend, I released my favorite books on resilience, and I'll be continuing to do more of that in the newsletter. So I'll be emailing my newsletter subscribers about books that help with optimism, books that help with anxiety, books that help with meaning making, stuff like that. So if you want to hear more about the books that have really influenced me, definitely sign up to my newsletter. And also, it's the first place where you'll hear about new products or promotional sales that I have going on my books, on my course, and so forth. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate you if you have. And yeah, I guess I'll see you next time. Take care.